Jean Peters arrived in Hollywood the way many futures once did, quietly, without spectacle, without a hunger that needed to be seen. She was not a woman who chased the spotlight. She was a woman the spotlight found, then decided it did not trust. In the late 1940 seconds, the studios were still learning how to recover from war. Audiences wanted strength again, but not chaos. They wanted women who looked capable without appearing threatening, intelligent without sounding defiant. Peters fit the silhouette perfectly. Athletic, self-possessed, unsentimental in a way that read as modern. When 20th Century Fox signed her in 1947, they believed they had found something controllable, a leading lady who could be shaped without resistance. That assumption would prove convenient and ultimately wrong. Her early roles suggested momentum. Films like Captain from Castile in 1947 placed her opposite Tyrone Power, not as decoration, but as equal presence. Critics noticed her restraint, the absence of theatrical excess. She did not perform vulnerability the way Hollywood expected. She inhabited it quietly. That unsettled people who preferred their actresses legible. Fox promoted her carefully. Posters emphasized beauty, but the studio kept her temperament off the page. Jean Peters did not gossip. She did not court scandal. She did not build alliances through attention. In an industry that thrived on exposure, her privacy became a liability. Hollywood does not like what it cannot narrate. By the early 1950 seconds, Peters had proven she could carry a film without excess. In Pickup on South Street in 1953, her performance cut against type. She played a woman bruised by life, toughened by disappointment, yet unwilling to surrender dignity. The role earned her critical acclaim and something more dangerous, respect, independent of the studio's machinery. That respect changed how power gathered around her. 20th Century Fox had invested heavily in controlling its stars. Contracts dictated schedules, appearances, and public behavior. Marriage clauses were not uncommon, and careers were often restructured around a woman's private life without her consent. For Peters, this control arrived masked as protection. She was offered fewer roles, but better ones. Her output slowed. The studio explained it as selectivity. Selectivity, in Hollywood, often means containment. Behind closed doors, Fox executives debated how much autonomy she should be allowed. Peters was talented, but she was not pliable. She questioned scripts. She resisted glamour for its own sake. She did not respond to pressure with gratitude. None of this was rebellion. It was simply refusal to disappear into expectation. The studio responded not with confrontation, but with adjustment. Roles were delayed, opportunities narrowed, her visibility became intermittent. The public assumed this was strategy. The truth was more delicate. Peters was being managed downward, not because she failed, but because she could not be easily owned. In 1957, she married Howard Hughes. The marriage would be presented later as choice, retreat, romance. At the time, it was something far more complex. Hughes was one of the most powerful men in America, deeply private, deeply controlling, and intensely suspicious of Hollywood. He disliked the studio system. He distrusted publicity. And once married, he did not hide his expectation that Peters would step away. Fox did not object. The studio had never been comfortable with Jean Peters' independence. Her withdrawal solved multiple problems at once. It removed a difficult asset from circulation while preserving a narrative of voluntary disappearance. She had chosen domestic life, the story went. She had walked away. Hollywood prefers endings that appear self-directed. What was not discussed publicly was how quickly her career stalled after the marriage. Contracts were not renewed. Scripts stopped arriving. The studio expressed understanding, respect. There was no formal banishment, no scandal to document, just a vanishing that felt clean enough to be unexamined. Jean Peters was 31 years old. For an actress of her caliber, this should have been the beginning of her most complex work. Instead, It became an intermission that never fully ended. Hughes's influence was pervasive but invisible. He discouraged acting. He isolated her from the industry. He framed withdrawal as safety. Control often disguises itself as care. The press accepted the story easily. Peters was described as reclusive, private content. The image fit neatly into Hollywood's comfort with women who exit quietly. There were no exposés, no interviews demanding explanation. Silence was interpreted as satisfaction. Behind that silence was a woman whose career had been slowly narrowed by forces that rarely leave fingerprints. A studio unwilling to negotiate autonomy. A marriage that redefined possibility. An industry relieved to let a complicated talent disappear without confrontation. The tragedy of Jean Peters did not announce itself in headlines. It unfolded through absence, through roles never played, through a voice removed from the cultural record at the moment it might have mattered most. Hollywood would remember her selectively, as a star who stepped away, as a woman who chose privacy over fame. These descriptions would harden into fact, not because they were proven, but because they were convenient. What remained unresolved was why a studio so invested in her potential allowed her disappearance so easily. Why control replaced cultivation? Why a career with momentum was permitted to dissolve without resistance? The answers were never meant to be public. And as the lights dimmed around Jean Peters, Hollywood told itself a familiar story, one that explained everything while revealing nothing at all. The question that lingered quietly, like smoke trapped in a closed room, was whether she had ever truly been free to choose her ending. At first, the narrowing of Jean Peters' career did not feel like confinement. It arrived gently, wrapped in reassurances, framed as concern. Hollywood had always known how to make restrictions sound like care. And Peters, private by nature, resistant to spectacle, did not immediately recognize the shift. After pickup on South Street in 1953, her standing should have been unambiguous. Critics praised her restraint, her refusal to overplay emotion, her ability to suggest an inner life without explanation. Directors noticed. Audiences remembered her. Yet at 20th Century Fox, enthusiasm cooled rather than intensified. Scripts did not accelerate. Offers slowed. Meetings ended with polite ambiguity. The studio's explanation was consistency. Peters was not to be overexposed. Her image required protection. She was different, they said. More serious, more selective, but selectivity was never truly hers. Fox had invested years perfecting an image economy that rewarded visibility only when it could be fully controlled. Peters did not participate in publicity rituals easily. She avoided gossip columns. She resisted the manufactured intimacy between stars and audiences. This reluctance, once charming, now appeared problematic. An actress who could not be easily narrated became difficult to market. Hollywood's response to difficulty is management, not negotiation. Internally, Peters was repositioned. She remained under contract, but her usefulness shifted from expansion to containment. She would appear when convenient, disappear when uncertain. The studio did not need to suppress her outright. It only needed to reduce her velocity. This reduction coincided with her growing association with Howard Hughes. Their relationship, initially discreet, became known within industry circles long before it became public. Hughes was not simply wealthy. He was unpredictable, suspicious, and fiercely proprietary. His reputation preceded him, and studios understood that proximity to Hughes complicated access. Fox executives watched carefully. When Peters married Hughes in January 1957, the industry responded with collective relief. The marriage offered a narrative that resolved multiple tensions at once. Her absence could now be explained as domestic choice. Her silence could be interpreted as preference. The studio no longer needed to manage her independence. It had been absorbed into something larger. Marriage, in Hollywood's vocabulary, often functioned as conclusion. What followed was swift and quiet. Peters' contract was not renewed with urgency. New roles did not materialize. There were no dramatic disputes, no legal entanglements. Fox expressed respect for her decision to step back. The phrasing was deliberate. Decision implies agency. It obscures context. Hughes, for his part, discouraged her return to acting. He distrusted Hollywood deeply, viewing it as corrupt, intrusive, hostile. He framed withdrawal as protection from exploitation. To outsiders, this sounded reasonable. To Peters, it became restrictive. Isolation does not always announce itself as harm. Sometimes it presents as safety. Life with Hughes was intensely private. He controlled movement, communication, and information. Peters was shielded from press, but also from opportunity. Acting required exposure, negotiation, autonomy. None of these fit comfortably within the boundaries Hughes enforced. Hollywood accepted this arrangement without resistance. No studio challenged Hughes's influence. No producer pushed to bring Peters back into circulation. The industry had learned when to retreat. Power recognizes power. The silence surrounding her disappearance grew thicker because it suited everyone involved. Hughes avoided scrutiny. Fox avoided complication. Hollywood avoided confrontation. Peters remained largely invisible, her absence normalized through repetition. Years passed this way. Occasionally, rumors surfaced that she might return. A role considered, a project discussed. These moments never crystallized. Each time, the momentum dissolved quietly, without explanation. The industry adjusted expectations downward. Jean Peters became a memory rather than a presence. What makes this period difficult to disentangle is how willingly the narrative of choice was accepted. Peters herself did not contest it publicly. Privacy had always been her instinct. She did not grant interviews demanding accountability. She did not frame her absence as loss. Hollywood interpreted this silence as consent. Yet consent, when shaped by imbalance, is rarely clean. Peters' withdrawal was influenced by forces that converged precisely when her independence became inconvenient. A studio uneasy with autonomy, a marriage that prioritized control, an industry content to let a talented actress disappear rather than renegotiate power. The convergence mattered. By the time Peters separated from Hughes in the early 1970s, the industry she might have returned to no longer resembled the one she had left. Roles for women her age were limited. The momentum that sustains relevance had long dissipated. Freedom, arriving late, offered little restoration. Hollywood did not revisit its role in her disappearance. It did not frame her absence as loss. It simply accepted the version of events it had helped construct. Jean Peters was remembered as the actress who walked away. What was forgotten was how thoroughly the conditions of walking away had been prepared. The studio system had learned how to relinquish responsibility while retaining control. By allowing her to vanish without conflict, it preserved its image of benevolence. No one was blamed. No wrong was acknowledged. Peters lived with the outcome quietly. She did not attempt to reclaim what had been taken. She adapted, as she always had, to the narrowed space available. Survival required it. The tragedy was not dramatic. It unfolded in slow adjustments, in the absence of calls, in the acceptance of silence as normal. The industry moved on, confident that the story had resolved itself. But stories that resolve too neatly usually hide something underneath. Jean Peters' career did not end with scandal or collapse. It ended with permission granted too easily for others to decide when her voice would no longer be heard. And once that permission was given, it was never revoked. Hollywood likes to believe that careers end for simple reasons: marriage, fatigue, a change of priorities. These explanations are comforting because they imply choice, and choice implies control. Jean Peters' disappearance from the screen was wrapped in exactly that language, repeated often enough to harden into fact. Yet beneath the calm surface of explanation lay a far more complicated exchange of power. When Peters married Howard Hughes, the industry stopped asking questions. not because the questions were answered, but because the answers were no longer safe to pursue. Hughes was not merely a husband. He was a force, one whose wealth, secrecy, and volatility made even studio executives cautious. His distrust of Hollywood was well known. He believed the industry exploited women, manufactured scandal, and consumed privacy. In this assessment, he was not entirely wrong. But his solution was not reform. It was removal. For Peters, this removal arrived incrementally. Invitations slowed, scripts ceased, friends drifted, life narrowed to a carefully managed orbit. Hughes framed the withdrawal as protection, as relief from a predatory system. And in many ways, Peters may have wanted that relief. She had never thrived on exposure. She disliked publicity. She did not measure fulfillment by headlines. But protection, when absolute, becomes indistinguishable from possession. Hollywood observed this shift from a distance and chose accommodation. No studio attempted to counter Hughes's influence. No producer tested the boundary. Peters was quietly reclassified as unavailable, not because she had declared herself so, but because power had declared it for her. This distinction mattered, even if it was never articulated. In the years following the marriage, Peters lived largely outside the public eye. She did not attend premieres. She did not campaign for roles. Her name faded from industry conversations. The absence was explained politely. She preferred privacy. She had chosen a different life. The narrative held because it was plausible. Yet what was missing from this narrative was any acknowledgement of what she had relinquished. A career built on discipline, restraint, and emotional precision does not simply evaporate without cost. Peters had not lost ability. She had lost access. Hughes's control was not theatrical, it was procedural. He discouraged contact. He filtered communication. He decided what was necessary and what was dangerous. Acting, with its exposure and unpredictability, fell into the latter category. Over time, this discouragement hardened into expectation. Hollywood complied easily. Studios have always understood how to step back when confronted with greater power. The studio system, once confident in its dominance, recognized in Hughes a rival authority it had no interest in challenging. Peters's absence became collateral. This convergent studio caution and marital control sealed her fate more effectively than any contract dispute could have. Years passed. Peters's name receded further into memory. When it surfaced, it did so as anecdote, as example, as curiosity. She had married well, the story went. She had chosen peace over ambition. The industry framed this as wisdom. What it did not frame was the loss itself. By the time Peters separated from Hughes, decades later, the landscape had changed beyond recognition. The roles that might have suited her no longer existed. The momentum that sustains careers had long since dissipated. Freedom, arriving after absence, offered little beyond autonomy without opportunity. Hollywood did not revisit her disappearance. It did not interrogate its own role in allowing a talented actress to vanish without resistance. The marriage had provided cover, and cover had done its work. What remains unsettling about this chapter is how thoroughly it normalized erasure. Peters was not blacklisted. She was not disgraced. She was simply allowed to disappear under circumstances that appeared voluntary. This subtlety protected everyone except the person at its center. Jean Peters did not return to reclaim her narrative. She did not publish memoirs or issue corrections. Silence, once adopted, became the only available language. To speak would have required revisiting a history that no one else seemed eager to remember. Hollywood prefers endings that absolve it of responsibility. Marriage offered such an ending. It allowed the industry to step away without admitting loss, to move forward without reckoning. Yet, absence is not resolution. It is postponement. Peters's story challenges the assumption that withdrawal equals choice. It suggests that freedom, when constrained by overlapping systems of control, becomes conditional. That a woman can step away and still be pushed, The marriage that rewrote Jean Peters' destiny did not do so through drama or decree. It did so through quiet agreement between a powerful husband, a cautious industry, and a cultural narrative that accepts silence as satisfaction. What was left behind was not scandal, but vacancy. A space where a career might have continued, where a voice might have evolved. Hollywood filled that space quickly, but the emptiness remained. And as years accumulated, the question grew heavier, not lighter. Did Jean Peters ever truly leave Hollywood? Or did Hollywood simply stop asking her to stay? The answer, buried beneath politeness and time, was never officially recorded. But it lingered, unresolved, in the long quiet that followed. By the time Jean Peters reached her 40s, Hollywood had already decided how her story would be remembered, or more precisely, how it would not be remembered. Her absence had settled into the background noise of the industry, a disappearance so gradual it no longer felt like loss, only adjustment. This is how Hollywood prefers its erasures. There was no announcement marking the end of her career, no farewell film, no final performance framed as closure. Peters simply ceased to be part of the ongoing conversation. New stars rose, new faces replaced old ones. The machinery moved forward without acknowledging what had been removed. From a distance, her life appeared enviable. She was wealthy, protected, married to one of the most powerful men in America. The press described her as reclusive but content, private but fulfilled. These descriptions were not challenged because they were not examined. They allowed the industry to remain uninvolved. Yet fulfillment is not the same as authorship. Peters had not stopped being an actress. She had stopped being permitted to practice the profession on her own terms. The skills she had honed, discipline, emotional restraint, intelligence without exhibition, had no outlet within the narrow world she now inhabited. Hollywood had been flawed, controlling, invasive, but it had also been the place where her abilities mattered. Without it, those abilities existed in suspension. The years passed with a strange stillness. She did not age in public the way other actresses did, transitioning into character roles or reinventing themselves for new eras. Her image remained frozen in the collective memory, young, capable, unfinished. This freezing made her easier to romanticize and easier to forget. Hollywood rarely knows what to do with women who step outside its timelines. Behind the scenes, the industry had little incentive to revisit her disappearance. To do so would have required acknowledging how easily a studio had relinquished responsibility for one of its most capable talents. It would have required asking why no one fought to bring her back, why absence had been accepted as solution. These questions remained unasked because they pointed outward, not inward. Meanwhile, Peters lived a life shaped by constraint, disguised as calm. Hughes's control grew more erratic over time. His isolation deepened. Peters remained loyal, protective, increasingly removed from the world she once inhabited. Contact with Hollywood figures became rare. Invitations stopped coming altogether. What had once been a pause had hardened into permanence. The tragedy of this phase lies not in spectacle, but in negation. There was no dramatic collapse, no public suffering, only the slow realization that the part of her life that allowed expression, challenge, and growth had been sealed off. She existed, but without dimension. Hollywood accepted this outcome without resistance. It told itself that Peters had chosen differently, that she preferred safety to struggle, that her silence indicated satisfaction. The narrative required no further maintenance. But silence is not evidence. It is often the absence of alternatives. As decades passed, Peters' name surfaced occasionally in retrospectives and lists actresses who left too soon, talents who vanished by choice. These references were affectionate but incomplete. They admired the image while ignoring the structure that made disappearance so easy. What no one examined was how her removal served the interests of multiple systems at once. A studio relieved of negotiation, a powerful husband assured of control. An industry spared the inconvenience of autonomy. The cost was borne privately. By the time Peters separated from Hughes, Her return was no longer viable in any meaningful sense. The roles that might have suited her no longer existed. The industry had moved on, and it did not look back. Freedom arrived, stripped of opportunity, autonomy without access. Hollywood interpreted this as natural progression. The pattern is familiar. A woman steps away, time passes, circumstances change, return becomes impractical. The system absolves itself by pointing to time rather than cause. What this explanation omits is how deliberately time was used as a tool, how absence was encouraged, normalized, then cemented, how a career was not destroyed, but slowly written out until its absence felt inevitable. Jean Peters' life during these years resists dramatic summary. It is not a cautionary tale of excess or self-destruction. It is quieter than that, and more unsettling. It suggests that erasure does not require malice, only convenience. Hollywood's moral ambiguity lives in these spaces. No one ordered her silence. No one demanded her disappearance. The conditions were simply arranged so that withdrawal became the path of least resistance. Once she stepped onto that path, the system closed behind her. This closure was never reversed. What remains unresolved is not whether Peters could have returned, but whether she was ever truly allowed to remain. Whether her independence, her refusal to perform Hollywood's version of femininity, had already marked her as expendable long before her marriage provided an explanation. The studio had contained her. The marriage had finalized it. The industry had moved on. By the time her story resurfaced in fragments, it had already been simplified. A woman who chose privacy, an actress who walked away. These phrases sounded neutral. They were not. They concealed a truth Hollywood had no interest in examining, that some careers are not ended by failure, but by systems that find autonomy inconvenient. Jean Peters did not disappear in a single moment. She was eased out, gently, politely, until nothing remained to return to. And because it happened without scandal, without protest, without noise, it became one of Hollywood's cleanest erasures, which is precisely why it endured. By the time Jean Peters reached middle age, Hollywood no longer considered her absence an absence at all. It had become background, a settled fact, absorbed into the mythology of an industry that prefers continuity over correction. Her life unfolded quietly beyond the frame, while the screen she once inhabited continued without her. This separation was not sudden. It was the cumulative result of years spent being slowly disengaged from relevance. Living with Howard Hughes meant existing inside a world governed by his rhythms, his fears, his rules. Peters adapted with the same discipline she had once brought to her craft. She learned patience. She learned silence. She learned how to make herself smaller without erasing herself entirely. To outsiders, this adaptation looked like contentment. To those who understood power, it looked like survival. Hollywood rarely distinguishes between the two. Peters' days were structured around privacy and restraint. There were no premieres, no sets, no scripts arriving in envelopes. Her connection to acting, once the central axis of her life, became memory rather than practice. Skills honed through repetition had no stage on which to evolve. Expression narrowed inward. This narrowing carried a cost that was not immediately visible. Identity, when disconnected from its outlet, begins to drift. Peters had defined herself through work that demanded emotional precision and physical presence. Without that work, she was left to negotiate who she was outside of performance. Hollywood did not concern itself with this negotiation. It had already moved on. Occasionally, her name appeared in passing. A columnist would mention her reclusiveness. A retrospective would note her early promise. These mentions were nostalgic, sanitized. They admired what she had been, not what had been taken from her. What remained unexamined was the imbalance that made her disappearance so easy. A studio system that preferred control to collaboration. A marriage that prioritized possession over partnership. An industry that accepted silence as explanation. Peters carried the weight of these forces privately. She did not challenge them publicly. To do so would have required confronting institutions far larger than herself, long after the moment when confrontation might have mattered. Time, used skillfully, had done its work. As Hughes's behavior grew more erratic, Peters's isolation deepened. He trusted few people. He tolerated fewer influences. Hollywood, once intrusive, became a distant memory. Peters's world narrowed further, shaped by loyalty and caution. Yet, even in this confinement, she did not collapse. There were no public breakdowns, no scandals to force recognition. She endured, and endurance once again protected the system that had constrained her. Hollywood could point to her stability as evidence that no harm had been done. But harm does not always announce itself as crisis. Sometimes it appears as potential never realized, as growth interrupted, as a life redirected by forces that never admit their presence. Peters's endurance concealed how thoroughly her trajectory had been altered. When she and Hughes separated in the early 1970 seconds, the moment arrived without fanfare. Decades had passed. The industry she might have returned to barely resembled the one she had left. Roles for women her age were scarce and narrow. The possibility of re-entry existed only in theory. Freedom, when delayed long enough, becomes abstract. Hollywood greeted the news of her separation with polite curiosity, not anticipation. There were no calls asking if she would return. No producers dusting off scripts. The system had already closed that chapter. Her absence had been normalized too thoroughly to undo. Peters did not attempt to reclaim her place. Perhaps she understood the futility. Perhaps she had learned that visibility came with conditions she no longer wished to accept. Perhaps the long silence had reshaped her desires. What matters is that the choice, once again, was framed as hers. This framing allowed Hollywood to maintain its self-image. It suggested that careers end naturally, that women step away willingly, that absence is benign. It obscured how power had guided each step long before withdrawal appeared voluntary. Peters lived the remainder of her life away from the industry's gaze. She did not write memoirs. She did not seek revision. Her story remained largely untold, preserved only in fragments and assumptions. The life she lived outside the frame was quieter, safer, narrower. It lacked the exposure she had once resisted, but it also lacked the creative friction that had given her work meaning. Hollywood had removed itself from her life, but not without leaving its mark. This mark was not bitterness, it was absence. An absence that grew heavier as years passed. An absence that was misinterpreted as peace. An absence that concealed the cost of being slowly written out of one's own story. Jean Peters did not vanish dramatically. She receded, guided by forces that preferred her stillness to her autonomy. The industry that had once shaped her image now benefited from her invisibility. And because her life continued without visible collapse, the erasure remained unchallenged. What followed was not tragedy in the conventional sense. It was something more unsettling. A life lived under the quiet understanding that certain doors, once closed by others, do not reopen no matter how patiently one waits. The frame had moved on, and Jean Peters remained just outside it. Her presence no longer required, her absence no longer questioned. The cost of that exclusion would only become clear much later, when the story was finally viewed in full and the silence around it could no longer explain itself. By the time Jean Peters stepped out from the long shadow of her marriage, Hollywood no longer recognized her as unfinished business. It recognized her, at best, as memory. The system she had once belonged to had changed just enough to claim progress, but not enough to correct what had been quietly taken from her. Freedom arrived late, and it arrived alone. When Peters and Howard Hughes separated in the early 1970 seconds, the press treated the news with restrained curiosity. There was no surge of speculation about a comeback, no breathless anticipation of her return to the screen. Hollywood did not wait for her. It had already rewritten its present without her participation. This absence of expectation was itself revealing. Decades earlier, her withdrawal had been explained as choice, framed as a preference for privacy over performance. That explanation hardened over time into identity. Jean Peters became the actress who left, the woman who stepped away, the one who did not need Hollywood anymore. By the time she was free to decide otherwise, the industry had stopped imagining her decisions mattered. Freedom, stripped of context, offers little. The landscape she re-entered was unrecognizable. Studios had consolidated. Contracts had softened in language but not in logic. Roles for women were narrower, more symbolic than substantial. The momentum required to sustain a career, relationships, visibility, continuity had dissipated long ago. To return would have required starting anew in an industry that no longer remembered how to make space for her. Hollywood did not deny her opportunity. It simply did not offer it. This distinction allowed the system to remain unchallenged. There was no refusal to document, no door slammed shut, only silence. Silence that suggested neutrality while functioning as exclusion. Peters understood this silence intuitively. Years of living within constraint had sharpened her awareness of unspoken limits. She did not campaign for attention. She did not announce her availability. She did not ask to be restored. To do so would have required believing restoration was possible. The truth was harsher. The years when her presence might have altered narratives were gone. Freedom now meant autonomy without audience, choice without consequence. Hollywood had always been skilled at allowing freedom once it no longer mattered. The irony was difficult to ignore. The industry that had once feared her independence now celebrated independence as virtue. Actresses spoke openly about boundaries, about refusing roles, about stepping away temporarily without forfeiting careers. These freedoms were framed as progress, as evidence that Hollywood had matured. What was missing from these celebrations was acknowledgement of those who had paid the cost earlier. Jean Peters was among them. Her resistance had not been loud or theatrical. It had been quiet, instinctive, rooted in a refusal to perform an identity that did not fit. For that refusal, she had been contained, then released only after containment had become irreversible. Hollywood rarely revisits such stories. They complicate narratives of growth. They suggest that progress was not inevitable, but extracted through individual loss. Peters lived her later years without bitterness, at least publicly. She did not seek vindication. She did not frame herself as victim. This restraint made her easier to forget and easier to praise abstractly. She was spoken of as dignified, private, strong. These adjectives, while flattering, obscured the cost of the life she had been guided into. Dignity, when imposed by circumstance, is not always chosen. Her name surfaced occasionally in retrospectives and film histories, often accompanied by phrases like underrated or ahead of her time. These phrases carried admiration without responsibility. They suggested that timing, rather than structure, had determined her fate. Timing is rarely neutral. The system that had once limited her had done so deliberately, even if quietly. It had decided when her presence was convenient and when it was not. By the time freedom arrived, that decision no longer required enforcement. Absence had become habit. Peters accepted this with the same composure that had marked her entire life. She lived privately, away from Hollywood's gaze, without attempting to revise the story others told about her. Silence, once again, was the least costly option. But silence does not erase history. It preserves it in unfinished form. The freedom Jean Peters gained in her later years did not restore her career, but it did reveal something essential about how Hollywood functions. Control does not need to be permanent to be effective. It only needs to last long enough to redirect a life. Once redirected, the system can release its grip and claim innocence. Hollywood did exactly that. By allowing Peters to be free when return was no longer viable, it absolved itself without restitution. It preserved its image as an industry of choice, while avoiding accountability for the choices it had constrained. Her story sits uncomfortably within that image. It suggests that freedom offered too late is not freedom at all, but closure without repair. Jean Peters did not reclaim what was taken from her. She did not challenge the narrative that framed her disappearance as preference. She lived quietly, with autonomy finally hers, but without the platform that had once made that autonomy meaningful. The frame had shifted, the camera had moved on. What remained was a life lived beyond the point where correction was possible, shaped by a system that understood exactly how long to hold on and exactly when to let go. The final chapter was approaching, and like the chapters before it, it would not be written by Hollywood. It would be shaped by absence, by timing, and by a silence that had already done its work. Jean Peters did not return to Hollywood for a curtain call. There was no reconciliation, no late career revival framed as triumph over absence. The industry that had once shaped her image allowed her to pass quietly through its memory, preserved in still frames and selected performances, detached from the conditions that had ended her career before it had fully matured. This, too, was a choice, just not hers. In her later years, Peters lived far from the machinery that had once defined her days. The noise of premieres and contracts had been replaced by routine, privacy, and a life that required no performance. From the outside, this looked like peace. From a distance, it appeared resolved. Hollywood prefers such endings. They require no explanation, but resolution is not the same as justice. Peters had been an actress formed by restraint and intelligence, qualities that rarely age out of relevance. Had her career continued on its natural course, she might have evolved into roles of increasing depth, women shaped by experience rather than novelty. Instead, that evolution was interrupted, redirected into silence, and later mistaken for choice. When retrospectives eventually revisited her work, they praised what survived. Her toughness in Pickup on South Street, her quiet authority, her refusal to overplay emotion. These reassessments arrived safely, after consequence had passed. They admired the artifact, while ignoring the fracture. Hollywood excels at this separation. The industry does not need to deny loss. It only needs to aestheticize it. In doing so, it converts absence into mystery, erasure into legend. Jean Peters became one of those legends, an actress who stepped away, who valued privacy, who chose a different life. The language sounded respectful. It concealed the mechanics beneath it. What was never publicly examined was how many systems had benefited from her withdrawal. A studio spared negotiation. A powerful husband assured control. An industry relieved of a woman who did not fit neatly into its expectations. Her disappearance resolved tensions without requiring accountability. Peters did not contest this story. She lived beyond it. When she died in 2000, the notices were brief and affectionate. They referenced her marriage, her privacy, her early success. They did not reopen old questions. Hollywood closed the book gently, satisfied that the ending appeared dignified. But dignity can coexist with loss. The final accounting of Jean Peters' career reveals something essential about how Hollywood shapes history. It does not erase talent outright. It redirects it, then waits for time to complete the work. Absence becomes habit. Habit becomes explanation. Explanation becomes truth. This process is clean because it is quiet. Peters' life challenges the idea that freedom in Hollywood is granted evenly or reclaimed easily. It suggests that autonomy, when asserted too early or too clearly, carries consequences that outlast the moment of resistance. That freedom offered later, when momentum has vanished, serves more to absolve the system than to restore the individual. Her story also complicates the romance of retreat. Leaving the spotlight is often framed as empowerment, especially for women. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it is the result of overlapping controls that make staying untenable. Peters' withdrawal contained both elements, but the balance was never publicly weighed. Hollywood did not want to weigh it. What remains is a life lived beyond the frame, shaped by decisions made quietly by others. Peters adapted with grace. She did not seek to correct the record. She did not turn her absence into accusation. This restraint has been mistaken for contentment. It should be understood instead as endurance. Endurance does not demand recognition. It absorbs consequence and continues. Peters endured a system that learned how to contain without confrontation, how to release without restitution. Her endurance allowed Hollywood to believe that no harm had been done. But harm does not require collapse to be real. The lost years of Jean Peters' career are not dramatic in the way Hollywood likes to dramatize tragedy. They are dramatic in a quieter sense. They represent a voice removed not by failure, but by convenience. A trajectory altered not by scandal, but by alignment of power. This alignment is the true subject of her story. Jean Peters was not destroyed. She was managed, then released when management had already achieved its aim. The studio system did not need to silence her outright. It only needed to step aside when another form of control took over. The industry would later congratulate itself on progress, on changed contracts, on greater autonomy, on lessons learned. It would not acknowledge who had paid for those lessons. Peters lived long enough to see the shape of that progress. She also lived with the knowledge that it arrived too late to matter to her. This knowledge did not make her bitter. It made her invisible. Hollywood's cleanest erasures are the ones that leave no mess behind. Jean Peters' absence left no scandal to investigate, no outrage to resolve. Only a question that lingers beneath the polished surface of her legend. How many careers end not because they fail, but because they are quietly redirected out of relevance? Her story offers no comfort, no simple moral. It offers clarity, that control does not always look like force, that erasure does not always look like disappearance, that some endings are written not in ink, but in the slow accumulation of silence. Jean Peters did not reclaim her narrative. Hollywood did not return it. Between those two truths lies the real ending of her story, unfinished, unresolved, and instructive in ways the industry has never been eager to examine. The camera moved on. The silence remained. And in that silence, a career that might have reshaped its era became one more legend explained, just enough to prevent the deeper question from ever being asked.